Hi, I'm Jason, and this is the second tutorial on SolidWorks API. And in this tutorial, we're going to do a quick demo of editing macro code and give a brief introduction into the SolidWorks API library. Okay, let's open up the code from the last tutorial. And just a reminder, this is the code that creates a cube part. And just so you can recall what it does, I'm going to hit the play button up here. I can run the macro directly from the VBA interface rather than this button up here. They both pretty much do the same thing, so I'm just going to run it through the VBA interface. And you can see the macro runs. And you'll notice that at the end of the macro, we actually recorded some camera movements of the part, which we don't really need for this macro. All we really want to do is just create a cube. So what we're going to do is edit our macro code to remove the commands that rotate the camera view towards the end. And at this point, we don't know what any of the commands are saying in the code. So one way that we could figure out what these lines of code are doing is to run through the code line by line and see what how each line affects the SolidWorks program. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So to run the code line by line, what we're going to do is add a breakpoint at the first line of code in the sub main. So when we play this, or when we run this program, it's going to stop at this first line of code. So let's close this document and let's run the code, and it will stop on the first line. So hit run, and now we're at the first line of code. Now to go through it line by line, you can press F8 or click the step into button. So I'm just going to press F8 and go through this line by line. So this runs the first line of code, and apparently, so far, this set SW app equal application.solidworks doesn't seem to do anything. So you can actually edit the code while it's running. I'm just going to add in this comment and say apparently this line doesn't do anything. So far this line of code doesn't seem to do anything. And now we're just going to keep running through this line by line and see what happens. So I press F8 to go to the next line of code, and you can see that the SolidWorks window opened up a new document. So let's add a comment. This opens new part document, and let's keep going through the code. So press F8, and so far it seems like none of these lines of code are doing anything to the SolidWorks window. So I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to block off or mark this line of code as doesn't seem to do anything. Let's make a note that this did not affect the SolidWorks window. Okay. Now let's keep going through our code and see what these other lines do. So notice that at least in the SolidWorks window, nothing is selected. If I run this next line of code, this bool status equals, you'll see that the front plane was selected. So let's mark that. This selects the front plane. Now let's run this next line of code, part.sketchmanager.insertSketch true, and you probably can guess that this inserts a sketch. So creates a sketch on the front plane. And let's keep going through. You'll notice that the front plane is still selected. I press the F8 to go to the next line of code. it's now not selected. So this part.clearSelection to true, unselected the front plane. Okay, keep going through the line of code. So I guess I already skipped through this dim VSK lines. I'd run the VSK lines again. That command created a square sketch on the front plane. So created square sketch. And let's just keep going. Next line of code, press F8. And that changed our viewing angle. So changes viewing angle to isometric view. Alright, let's keep going through all these lines of code. At this point, you'll notice that all the lines of the sketch are selected, and you might be able to guess that this part clear selection true is going to probably affect that. I press F8. Now none of them are selected. So you notice that this command part clear selection true unselected all of the lines, and the same command which we saw up here, part.clear selection true, deselected the front plane. So we can probably guess that this clear selection is deselecting anything that's being selected. So at this point we're starting to understand some of the lines, what some of these lines of code are doing. If we keep going through the rest of this code, so now we're at this bool stats equals part yada yada yada. If we cycle through these, we start to notice that the lines in the sketch in the SolidWorks window are being selected. So these lines of code selected sketch segments. So selected sketch segments. Alright. Now let's go to this next line of code. Run that, see what happens. And now we have extruded the sketch into a cube. So this line of code that we just ran must extrude the sketch. Extrudes sketch. Okay. Now you'll see back here on the SolidWorks window that the back sketch is still selected. And if we keep running, actually it'll still be selected. Alright, well let's just keep going through the code. Now I notice that these lines of code are actually affecting the camera angle in the SolidWorks window. So this model.rotate about center, we can guess that this is actually rotating the camera angle. If I actually hold down F8, see what happens. You actually see the cube start to rotate. So let's mark off this whole section of code. We'll say these commands rotate camera view. Now I could just keep playing through these, but you can see that's a lot of lines of code. So what I'm actually going to do is just add a breakpoint at the end and just run through them all by just continuing through the code by pressing play. And we'll stop at this last breakpoint. Okay. And now, as I alluded to earlier, the sketch that was made from which the extruded cube was made from is still selected. If I run this last bit of code, this part.clearSelection true, you can guess that it's deselected. So again, this part.clearSelection true removes, or I should say deselects any selection. And last line of code end sub, that will end the program. So we can, just from writing through the code line by line, we can kind of get an idea of what lines of code were important and which weren't, and what lines of code and how each line of code affected the SolidWorks interface. So what would happen if we started to remove some of these lines of code that we didn't think were necessary or appeared not to do anything? So we could actually do that. So if you remember that this line of code didn't seem to do anything, so what I'm going to do is actually comment it out, save it, and then I'm going to close down and reopen this application and run it and see what happens. So let's close everything down. And reopen it. Bring up the macro that we were working with, and let's rerun the code now with this first line being commented out. See what happens. And you can see that we have an error. So even though this line of code didn't seem to affect the SolidWorks window, apparently it is important. If I hit debug, they're saying that there's an error on the second line of code. So let's just stop and remove the comments so that exists, and let's run it again and see what happens. Okay, and now the macro is running. So we know that this first line of code is important. But what is it doing? What does this mean? So this is going to be our introduction into the SolidWorks library. Alright, so let's talk about the first line of code that we commented out and gave us some trouble when we ran it with it removed. What is going on here? Well, first, for some reason, the SolidWorks macro recorder likes to take this line and break it up into two lines, which is just kind of odd and confusing. What we can do is actually just rewrite it as all in one line, which is kind of easier to read, so we'll do that. So what is this? What's going on? If you notice, this application is referenced nowhere else in the code. It's by itself. So what is this application? The application is SolidWorks. It's the program. It's what you see to the right. It's what you see as SolidWorks. And this application is what we are going to control. So maybe another way to explain this is, had I opened up SolidWorks twice, meaning I have two open SolidWorks programs, completely different, I can run them both, I could run either one. When I open up a edit macro from one particular SolidWorks program that I have open, this Visual Basic interface is linked to that particular SolidWorks program that's open. Meaning when I click run here, it's only going to command the SolidWorks program that's linked to, and not both of them at the same time. So in a sense, this application is what you see to the right. It is SolidWorks. Now when we set SWApp equal to application, first we're linking it to this SolidWorks program, and then we're also setting it to equal to the .SolidWorks. So this application.SolidWorks is the highest level object in the SolidWorks library. So what is the library? The SolidWorks library is all of the methods and commands that we will use to operate SolidWorks as a program. That is the SolidWorks library. And you can actually see all the commands that make up the SolidWorks library if you go to help. So we're going to do that right now just so you can see what I'm talking about. So make sure that you go to help and deselect the use SolidWorks web help. The web help isn't very useful. The offline version is much better, so we'll deselect it so it's disabled and then go to API help. And this index, so if you have the index open, you will see every method that encompasses the SolidWorks library. It goes on and on and on. These are all the commands that we can work with to control SolidWorks. So let's just search for something. Let's search for the highest object in the SolidWorks library. So if I type in SolidWorks and search, I will find the SolidWorks interface, and it will have a description down below. You'll see that under remarks. This interface is the highest level object in the SolidWorks API. So from this object, we can then have access to all the other methods and objects in SolidWorks to command the whole program. Now, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, that's okay. We are going to spend a lot of time talking about this library in future tutorials. So this is where we're going to end the program, or in this tutorial. Like I said before, if you have any particular subjects you want me to cover, just leave them in the comments below and I'll get to them. And in the following tutorials, we'll be talking a lot about this library so you have a better understanding of what it is. Okay, see you at the next tutorial.